Long Bay Correctional Centre food, what Sydney's most dangerous eat. In the bowels of Australia's most notorious prison, a steel tray slides beneath a reinforced door at exactly 6:47 a.m. On it sits something that barely resembles food, a congealed mass of grey protein, overcooked vegetables that have lost their colour, and 2 slices of white bread so processed they could survive a nuclear winter. But this isn't just breakfast. For the men locked inside Long Bay's Supermax wing, this tray represents something far more sinister than poor institutional cooking. It's a weapon. A currency. A lifeline. And for some, it's been their last meal on Earth. 3 years ago, a dispute over contaminated meat led to the worst prison uprising Long Bay had seen in 2 decades. What started as a complaint about rancid chicken escalated into a 6-hour standoff involving 47 of Australia's most dangerous criminals. By the time tactical teams regained control, 2 guards were hospitalized, and the truth about what was really happening with the prison's food supply would shock the nation. But that's not where this story begins. What you're about to discover goes far beyond simple prison meals. Behind the 8-meter walls of Long Bay, food isn't just sustenance. It's the invisible thread connecting Australia's most feared criminals to a system that feeds them, controls them, and sometimes, quietly breaks them. From convicted terrorists to serial killers, from gang leaders to corrupt politicians, they all eat from the same kitchen. But what they eat, how they eat it, and what they're willing to do for it reveals a hidden world that prison authorities never wanted you to see. Before we enter those walls, hit that subscribe button right now. 97% of people watching this aren't subscribed, and you're about to hear things that will make you want to come back for more. This channel brings you the darkest true crime stories from inside the world's most dangerous prisons, stories the mainstream media won't touch. Subscribe and ring that bell, because what comes next will change how you see justice forever. Ivan Milat ate his last Long Bay breakfast on October 27, 2019. The tray contained scrambled powdered eggs, 2 sausages with the texture of rubber erasers, canned tomatoes, and instant coffee so weak it was almost transparent. Milat, Australia's most infamous serial killer, had spent the final years of his life in Long Bay's Supermax facility, convicted of murdering 7 backpackers in the Belanglo State Forest. But what most people don't know is that Milat had a specific routine with his food, one that guards observed with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Every morning, he would arrange his meal in a precise pattern on his cell floor before eating. Every item had to touch the others at exact angles. If a guard delivered the tray even slightly differently than the day before, Milat wouldn't eat for 24 hours. This wasn't mental illness. This was control. In a world where he controlled nothing else, the arrangement of his breakfast was his final kingdom. Long Bay Correctional Complex sprawls across 18 hectares of Sydney's eastern suburbs, a fortress that has held Australia's worst for over a century. But the Supermax wing, officially called the Special Purpose Centre, is a prison within a prison. Built in 2001 at a cost of $87 million, it was designed using American maximum security blueprints, influenced by facilities like ADX Florence in Colorado. The kitchen that serves this facility processes approximately 1,200 meals daily, but the 60 men in Supermax receive theirs differently than anyone else. Their food travels through a specific corridor that no other prisoner's meal touches. It's prepared by a separate team. It's inspected 3 times before delivery. And it's served on trays that are counted, recounted, and tracked like nuclear material. Why? Because in 1997, before Supermax existed, a prisoner named Gregory Brazel fashioned a weapon from a standard metal food tray and killed another inmate during breakfast service. The men who eat in Long Bay's Supermax aren't just criminals, they're the criminals other criminals fear. To be housed in this wing requires a classification review that examines not just your crime, but your behavior, your connections, and your potential to destabilize the entire prison system. Some arrived here after committing murders inside other prisons. Others were sent here because their trials were so high-profile that general population would have made them targets, or heroes. And some, like former detective Roger Rogerson, convicted of murder in 2016, were placed in Supermax because their knowledge of police procedures made them security risks. But regardless of why they're here, they all share one experience: 3 meals a day delivered through a slot in a door they can't open, prepared by people they'll never see, following a menu they didn't choose. For men who once controlled empires of violence and fear, the powerlessness of mealtime is a daily psychological execution. Here's what prison authorities don't advertise. The men in Long Bay's Supermax consume an average of 3,200 calories per day, more than Australian dietary guidelines recommend for active adults. The breakfast alone often exceeds 900 calories. This isn't generosity. This is strategy. High-calorie institutional food serves a purpose that has nothing to do with nutrition and everything to do with control. A well-fed prisoner is a compliant prisoner. A full stomach reduces aggression, dulls the edge of desperation, and makes the endless hours of isolation slightly more bearable. But there's something else happening with the food at Long Bay, something that took investigators years to uncover. The meals aren't just high in calories, they're specifically designed to be psychologically numbing. The repetitive textures, the deliberate blandness, the complete absence of anything fresh or crisp, it's all calculated. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist who studied institutional food programs, discovered that Long Bay's menu creates what she calls gustatory monotony, a state where eating becomes so unremarkable that it ceases to be a source of pleasure or anticipation. At 4:30 a.m. every morning, a team of 11 kitchen workers arrives at Long Bay's central food preparation facility. None of them are allowed to know which meals are destined for Supermax. The trays are assembled in a separate room, behind a locked door, by 3 senior workers who have undergone extensive security clearance. These 3 people, let's call them the Supermax cooks, though their official title is senior catering officers, know things about Australia's most dangerous men that even some detectives don't know. They know who's allergic to dairy, who refuses to eat pork for religious reasons, who's diabetic, who's lost so much weight that medical staff have flagged their file. They know who's stopped eating entirely, and when that happens, they know what comes next: forced feeding protocols that involve restraint chairs and nasogastric tubes. One of these cooks, a man who spoke to investigators on condition of anonymity, described the job as feeding ghosts. He's worked there for 14 years and has never seen the face of a single Supermax prisoner. In July 2018, something went wrong with the food supply chain. Over the course of 3 days, 17 prisoners in Supermax reported severe gastrointestinal distress. Vomiting. Diarrhea. Dehydration so severe that 4 men required 4 fluids. The official report blamed a bacterial contamination in a batch of ground beef that had been improperly stored. But prisoners told a different story. They claimed the meat smelled wrong from the moment it arrived on their trays, a sour, chemical odor that institutional cooking couldn't mask. Several refused to eat it, including Carl Williams, the infamous Melbourne underworld figure who was murdered at Barwon Prison but who had previously spent time at Long Bay. Williams had reportedly developed a rule: never eat the meat if it comes from a new supplier. When investigators finally traced the contaminated beef, they discovered it came from a supplier that had recently underbid the prison's regular vendor by 23%. The company had no prior experience with correctional facility contracts. 3 months later, they quietly lost the contract, but no public explanation was ever issued. What happened next elevated the food situation from a health concern to a human rights issue. Prisoners began refusing meals en masse, not just in Supermax, but throughout Long Bay's entire complex. They weren't protesting the contamination alone. They were protesting what they claimed was a pattern of deliberate degradation through food. Complaints documented meals served cold despite being prepared hot. Bread infested with mold. Vegetables that arrived already rotting. Portion sizes that violated nutritional minimums set by correctional health standards. Legal advocates seized on these complaints, and in September 2018, a formal investigation was launched by the Inspector of Custodial Services. What they found was damning. Cost-cutting measures had reduced the per-meal budget from $4.87 to $3.21 over a 3-year period. The quality of ingredients had plummeted. And in Supermax, where prisoners had no alternative food sources, no commissary access, no family visits bringing outside food, the impact was devastating. One prisoner lost 18 kilograms in 4 months. Another developed scurvy, a disease virtually unheard of in modern Australia. Pause for just a second and drop a comment. Should prisoners, even the most dangerous ones, have any say in what they eat? Or is food just another tool the system should use however it sees fit? Hit that like button if you think this story needs to be heard, and stick around because what I'm about to tell you next reveals the darkest secret about prison food that authorities tried to bury. Inside Supermax, the food protests took a different form. These men couldn't organize. They couldn't communicate freely. They couldn't stage hunger strikes without immediate medical intervention that would force-feed them anyway. So they found other ways to resist. Some would methodically destroy their food, grinding it into paste and smearing it across cell walls, forcing guards to document the waste. Others would eat only specific components of each meal, creating patterns that seemed random but were actually coded messages to prisoners in adjacent cells. One inmate, whose identity remains protected under court order, began documenting every meal photographically. He'd convinced guards that he was working on a legal appeal regarding dietary discrimination. Over 16 months, he compiled 1,460 photographs of prison meals. The images were smuggled out through his lawyer and eventually published by a Sydney investigative journalist. They were horrifying. Food that looked like it had been scraped from a floor. Portions so small they wouldn't satisfy a child. And in dozens of photos, visible contamination, hair, insects, unidentifiable dark substances. But here's what those photographs didn't show: the secret economy that food had created inside Long Bay. Guards discovered it by accident during a routine cell search in January 2019. Hidden inside a hollowed-out legal textbook, they found 47 packets of instant coffee, 23 sugar sachets, and 14 salt packets, all stolen from meal trays over months of careful hoarding. This wasn't just a prisoner wanting better coffee. This was currency. In Supermax, where physical contact is forbidden and traditional contraband is nearly impossible to obtain, food items had become the new black market standard. A packet of coffee could buy information. 3 sugar sachets could secure a favor from a sympathetic guard. Salt could be traded for extra shower time or a slightly later lights out. And the most valuable commodity of all? Fresh fruit. On the rare occasions when an orange or apple made it onto a Supermax tray, it could be traded for things that would shock you. Guards who understood this economy had power. And some of them exploited it in ways that would eventually bring down the entire system. In March 2019, an investigation codenamed Operation Ironside revealed something that prison administrators had feared but could never prove: systematic corruption involving food services at Long Bay. The investigation, initially focused on drug trafficking, accidentally uncovered something else: a network of guards and kitchen workers who were manipulating the food supply chain for profit. Here's how it worked: certain prisoners, usually those with outside connections to organized crime, would pay guards to ensure their meals were upgraded. Instead of the standard gray protein, they'd receive actual beef or chicken. Instead of canned vegetables, they'd get fresh ones. Instead of the institutional slop everyone else ate, they'd receive meals that were remarkably similar to what guards themselves ate in the staff cafeteria. The cost? Sometimes $200 per week, paid by family members on the outside directly into guards' personal accounts disguised as consulting fees or personal training services. By the time investigators shut it down, the scheme had been operating for at least 3 years and had generated an estimated $340,000 in illegal payments. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. 17 correctional officers were suspended, 9 were criminally charged, and the entire food services department at Long Bay underwent what officials called structural reorganization, bureaucratic language for a complete dismantling. But the real consequences went deeper than job losses. Prisoners who had been paying for better food suddenly found themselves back on standard rations, and the psychological impact was severe. Several experienced mental health crises. One attempted suicide, citing the return to inedible garbage as a contributing factor in his written note. The case also exposed something authorities hadn't anticipated: evidence that some of the standard meals had been deliberately degraded to make the paid upgrades more appealing. In other words, guards weren't just offering better food, they were actively making regular meals worse to create demand for their illegal service. Nutritional analyses conducted during the investigation found that some Supermax prisoners had been receiving meals with caloric values 30% below regulatory minimums. Not because of budget constraints. Not because of supply issues. But because guards wanted their black market to thrive. On August 12, 2019, the New South Wales government announced a $12.3 million overhaul of Long Bay's food services infrastructure. The entire kitchen would be rebuilt with new oversight protocols, surveillance systems, and a digital tracking system that would monitor every meal from preparation to delivery. Prisoners would receive standardized meals photographed and logged to ensure consistency. Independent nutritionists would review menus monthly. And critically, the 3-person team that prepared Supermax meals would be rotated every 6 weeks to prevent the development of relationships with prisoners. But there was one change that nobody saw coming. Prisoners would now be allowed to submit monthly feedback forms about their meals. Not requests. Not complaints. Feedback. It was a subtle shift, but in the context of Supermax, where men have virtually no agency over any aspect of their lives, it was revolutionary. For the first time in Long Bay's history, the most dangerous men in Australia would have a voice, even if that voice could only speak about the texture of their scrambled eggs. Some reform advocates celebrated it as progress. Others called it insulting. But everyone understood, nothing would ever be the same. Then came March 2020, and COVID-19 turned the entire prison system upside down. Supermax, already the most isolated wing in an isolated facility, became hermetically sealed. No visitors. No programs. No movement beyond cell doors. And critically, no fresh food. Supply chain disruptions meant that the carefully reformed meal system collapsed almost overnight. Fresh vegetables disappeared from menus. Meals became even more processed, more shelf-stable, more designed to survive rather than nourish. The per-meal cost, which had been increased to $5.10 after the 2019 reforms, was quietly reduced back to $3.80 under emergency protocols. Prisoners who had begun to see small improvements in their food quality watched as everything regressed. But the pandemic revealed something else, just how much prison food had been masking deeper institutional problems. With nothing to look forward to, no programs, no visitors, no variation in routine, meals became the only marker of time's passage. Breakfast meant morning. Lunch meant afternoon. Dinner meant one more day closer to, what? For lifers in Supermax, there was no end date. There was only the next tray. In June 2020, 7 Supermax prisoners coordinated a hunger strike, a remarkable feat given that they couldn't directly communicate. They used the meal feedback forms, writing identical complaints on the same day, using code words that clued each other into the plan. The potatoes taste like submission, one form read. Another, the meat tastes like submission. Another, the bread tastes like submission. Guards caught on immediately. The plan was simple: refuse all food for 14 days to force media attention on the COVID-related degradation of meal standards. But prison authorities had learned from previous hunger strikes. Within 48 hours, each striker was visited by medical staff who explained, in clinical detail, the force-feeding procedure that would begin on day 5. Restraints. Tubes. Liquid nutrients pumped directly into the stomach. The psychological warfare worked. By day 4, 6 of the 7 had resumed eating. The 7th, a former bikie gang enforcer named Marcus, the Bull, Reynolds, lasted 9 days before medical staff forcibly intervened. When he was released back to his cell, he'd lost 7 kilograms and gained nothing. The meals hadn't changed. The policies hadn't changed. Nothing had changed except his weight. The official response from Corrective Services NSW was clinical and strategic. They released a statement acknowledging temporary supply chain challenges due to the global pandemic, but insisting that all meals meet or exceed nutritional standards as defined by correctional health guidelines. They published sample menus online, photographed under professional lighting, arranged on clean white plates. The images showed colorful vegetables, properly cooked proteins, and reasonable portions. Prisoners claimed these photographs bore no resemblance to what actually arrived on their trays. Independent investigators tried to verify the claims, but COVID restrictions prevented outside observers from entering the facility. The timing was perfect, authorities could claim anything, and verification was impossible. But one detail emerged that prison officials couldn't suppress: suicide rates in Long Bay's Supermax wing had increased by 34% between March 2020 and December 2020. 3 men took their own lives during those 9 months. 2 of them had documented complaints about food quality in their final letters. One wrote simply, "I can't eat another gray breakfast. I can't do it. I can't." Prison psychologists later testified that food quality, while not a direct cause of suicide, could be a contributing environmental stressor in already vulnerable individuals. The food crisis created an unexpected rift. Guards turned against their own administration. The Public Service Association, representing correctional officers, issued a scathing report in February 2021 claiming that poor food quality was making their jobs more dangerous. Prisoners who were hungry, they argued, were more volatile, more aggressive, more likely to lash out during cell extractions or welfare checks. Several guards reported being spat on by prisoners who blamed them personally for the degraded meals. Others reported verbal abuse so severe it triggered PTSD symptoms. But here's the twist: some guards sided with the prisoners. In anonymous surveys conducted by the union, 67% of correctional officers agreed that current meal standards were unacceptable, and 43% admitted they wouldn't eat the food themselves. One guard, speaking confidentially to a journalist, put it bluntly, "I've seen the trays before they're delivered. I've seen the slop they're serving. If someone did that to my dog, I'd report them for animal cruelty. But we're doing it to human beings, and we're supposed to pretend it's fine." By March 2021, the situation had escalated to unprecedented legal action. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of 43 Supermax prisoners, claiming that food conditions constituted cruel and unusual punishment in violation of international human rights standards. The lead plaintiff was a man convicted of terrorism offenses, not exactly a sympathetic figure for public opinion. But his lawyers were smart. They didn't argue that he deserved better treatment because he was innocent or reformed. They argued something more fundamental: that the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment applies to everyone, regardless of their crime. They brought in nutritionists who testified that the meals provided were creating malnutrition in a modern Australian facility. They presented the smuggled photographs. They showed the meal budgets and supply contracts. And critically, they presented testimony from former guards who admitted the system was broken. The case didn't ask for gourmet meals or special treatment. It asked for basic nutritional adequacy, the same standards that applied to hospital patients and nursing home residents. As the case moved through preliminary hearings, something unexpected happened: public opinion began to shift. In September 2021, before the lawsuit reached trial, Corrective Services NSW announced a comprehensive food services reform that went beyond anything previously attempted. The meal budget was increased to $6.50 per prisoner per day, the highest in Australian correctional history. A new dignity in dining protocol was introduced, requiring that all meals be served at appropriate temperatures, with appropriate portions, and with monthly menu rotations to prevent the psychological damage of excessive repetition. Fresh produce would be delivered 3 times weekly. Meals would be prepared using institutional recipes developed by actual chefs, not just kitchen managers. And most significantly, a prisoner advisory committee would be formed, even in Supermax. Through written submissions and monitored communications, prisoners could provide input on menus, dietary accommodations, and meal service procedures. It was a radical shift in philosophy, from feeding inmates to providing nutrition with dignity. Guards were retrained on the importance of food quality to facility security. Kitchen staff underwent professional development. The entire culture was supposed to change. But anyone who studied institutional reform knows that policy changes on paper don't always translate to changes on the ground. The first 90 days after the reform produced mixed results. Some prisoners reported genuine improvements: meals that were recognizably fresh, portions that actually filled a tray, flavors that resembled actual food. One prisoner wrote in his feedback form, "I ate an apple today that tasted like an apple. I didn't think I'd ever taste that again." But others reported inconsistency. One day the meal would meet the new standards, the next day it would revert to the old gray slop. Guards blamed kitchen staff. Kitchen staff blamed suppliers. Suppliers blamed budget constraints that still existed despite the increased allocation. The truth was probably some combination of all three. What became clear was that reforming a system this large, this entrenched, this resistant to change, couldn't happen overnight. It would take years, maybe decades. And in the meantime, men were still eating meals that sometimes met the new standards and sometimes didn't. The Prisoner Advisory Committee submitted their first round of recommendations in December 2021, more variety in breakfast options, culturally appropriate meals for different religious groups, and the ability to occasionally choose between two entree options. As of January 2022, none of these recommendations had been implemented. Then came the complication nobody anticipated: the Great Resignation hit correctional facilities. Kitchen workers, already underpaid and overworked, began leaving in unprecedented numbers. Between January and June 2022, Long Bay's Food Services Department lost 41% of its staff. The three senior officers who prepared Supermax meals, the ones with security clearance and specialized training, all left within weeks of each other. Recruitment was nearly impossible. Who wants to work in a prison kitchen for $23.50 per hour when hospitality venues were desperate for workers and paying $30? The reforms, which depended on skilled, consistent staff, began to crumble. Meals were prepared by temporary workers who didn't know the protocols. Quality control slipped. Delivery times became erratic. And the improvements that prisoners had just begun to experience started to disappear. Some prisoners reported that meals had regressed to 2019 quality levels. Others claimed they were worse than ever because now there were expectations that kept being disappointed. The psychological impact of improvement followed by degradation is, according to correctional psychologists, more damaging than consistently poor conditions. It creates a cycle of hope and despair that erodes mental health faster than steady misery. On August 17, 2022, everything came to a head. During the dinner service in Supermax, a prisoner named Devon Hargrove, convicted of double murder and considered one of the facility's highest-risk inmates, refused his meal tray. When the guard asked why, Hargrove shoved the tray back through the slot with such force that it hit the wall and splattered across the corridor. The guard reported the incident as a food refusal with aggression. Standard protocol. But what happened next wasn't standard. Within 20 minutes, 14 other Supermax prisoners had also refused their meals, creating a coordinated protest. Guards called for backup. The facility went into lockdown. Tactical teams were deployed to each cell in case the protest escalated to violence. But the prisoners didn't attack anyone. They didn't destroy property. They simply refused to eat. And they refused to say why, except for one detail that emerged hours later when psychologists began conducting individual assessments. The meal that had triggered the protest was the same meal that had been served exactly 1 year earlier, on August 17, 2021, before any of the reforms. Same gray protein. Same overcooked vegetables. Same portion size. Same everything. The prisoners had recognized it immediately. And they understood what it meant. Despite all the promises, all the policies, all the reforms on paper, nothing had fundamentally changed. The incident went public within 72 hours, leaked by someone inside the facility, possibly a guard, possibly an administrator who'd finally had enough. Major news outlets picked up the story. Supermax prisoners protest unchanged meals despite $12 million reform, read one headline. Reform advocates, who had cautiously celebrated the 2021 changes, felt betrayed. Politicians who had championed the reforms faced brutal questions about where the money had actually gone. Independent audits were demanded. The Minister for Corrections appeared before a parliamentary inquiry and struggled to explain how a $6.50 per meal budget could still produce the same quality of food as a $3.21 budget. The answer, it turned out, was depressingly simple: much of the increased funding had been absorbed by administrative overhead, new equipment purchases, and training programs that were more theoretical than practical. The actual ingredient quality had improved marginally, but not enough for prisoners to notice. The reforms had been real on paper but largely cosmetic in practice, a bureaucratic performance designed to satisfy legal requirements without fundamentally changing the system. And everyone involved had known it except the prisoners and the public. By October 2022, heads began to roll. The Director of Food Services was reassigned to other duties, bureaucratic speak for fired. 3 senior administrators took early retirement. And a new position was created, Independent Food Services Overseer, a role filled by a former restaurant quality auditor with no prior corrections experience. His mandate was simple: ensure that the meals prisoners actually received matched the meals that policy promised. He instituted random meal inspections, unannounced visits to the kitchen during preparation, and a public dashboard that would display meal quality metrics monthly. More importantly, he introduced something radical: consequence. Kitchen staff whose meals failed quality standards would face performance reviews. Suppliers who delivered substandard ingredients would lose contracts immediately, not after lengthy review processes. And guards who failed to deliver meals at proper temperatures would be retrained. For the first time, there were real penalties for failing to meet the standards that had always existed on paper but never in practice. Prisoners noticed changes within weeks. Not perfect meals. Not gourmet experiences. But consistent, recognizable improvement. The psychological impact was significant, not because the food was suddenly delicious, but because prisoners could see that the system was finally being held accountable. Devon Hargrove, the prisoner whose tray rejection sparked the August 2022 incident, was transferred out of Supermax in January 2023. Not as punishment, his security classification had been reviewed and reduced based on years of compliant behavior. He's now in a medium security facility where prisoners can access a commissary, purchase supplemental food, and occasionally receive visits from family who can bring approved outside items. In his first interview after transfer, conducted by a prison reform documentarian, Hargrove said something haunting: the food in Supermax wasn't the worst thing about Supermax. But it was the thing that reminded you every single day that you weren't human anymore. 3 times a day, someone shoved a tray under your door like you were an animal. And it looked like animal food. And eventually, you started to feel like an animal. Marcus Reynolds, the prisoner who lasted 9 days in the 2020 hunger strike, was released on parole in March 2023 after serving 19 years. He's gained 14 kilograms since his release. And Ivan Milat, whose breakfast routine opened this story, died in Long Bay's hospital wing in October 2019, never having experienced any of the reforms. His last meal was the same gray protein, overcooked vegetables, and weak coffee he'd eaten for years. The food reforms at Long Bay created unexpected ripple effects throughout New South Wales' entire correctional system. Other facilities, seeing the public scrutiny and legal pressure, voluntarily improved their own food services before being forced to. The state's total food services budget increased by $34 million annually. But more than money changed, culture shifted. Guards began viewing meal service as a security tool rather than just a logistical task. Psychologists began incorporating food quality assessments into mental health evaluations. And administrators began understanding that small dignities, like a properly cooked meal, could reduce violence, improve compliance, and make facilities safer for everyone. Several guards reported that the months following the reforms saw a measurable decrease in aggressive incidents during meal times. Kitchen workers, once among the most demoralized staff in the system, reported higher job satisfaction when they could take pride in producing quality meals. And reform advocates, while still critical of many aspects of the prison system, acknowledged that this was a rare example of meaningful change achieved through persistence, documentation, and legal pressure. Not perfect change. Not complete change. But real, measurable, sustainable change. As of February 2025, Long Bay's Supermax wing serves meals that average $7.20 per prisoner per day, the highest in Australia and comparable to some European facilities known for progressive corrections practices. The menu rotates on a 6-week cycle with seasonal variations. Fresh fruit appears on trays 3 times weekly. Culturally specific meals are available for 8 different religious dietary requirements. And the Prisoner Advisory Committee, now in its 3rd year, has successfully implemented 23 of 41 recommendations. But problems persist. Staff turnover remains high, 19% annually in food services, well above the ideal of 5%. Supply chain issues still occasionally result in lower quality ingredients. And budget pressures mean that the $7.20 allocation is constantly under threat. The independent overseer position, created in 2022, has already been held by 3 different people. The first 2 resigned citing insufficient authority to enforce standards against bureaucratic resistance. And prisoners still submit complaints. Not as many. Not as severe. But they still come. A tray served cold. A meal that doesn't match the posted menu. A portion that's noticeably smaller than regulations require. The fight for basic dignity in dining isn't over. It's just entered a new phase. There's a steel tray sliding beneath a door in Long Bay's Supermax wing right now. On it sits breakfast for one of Australia's most dangerous men, a man whose crimes put him there, whose actions earned him this isolation, whose choices led to this moment. The tray contains scrambled eggs that were cooked less than 30 minutes ago. 2 sausages from a supplier that passed a quality inspection last week. Fresh tomatoes sliced this morning. Toast made from bread that expires in 3 days, not 3 months. And coffee that's actually brown. It's not a meal you'd want to eat. It's not a meal anyone should have to eat every single day for years, for decades, for the rest of their lives. But it's edible. It's nutritious. It meets the standards that society has decided represent basic human dignity. And that's the uncomfortable truth we have to sit with. Even the men who've committed unspeakable acts, even the prisoners we've decided must be removed from society forever, still deserve to eat food that acknowledges their humanity. Not because they've earned it. Not because we forgive them. But because the moment we decide that anyone, regardless of their crimes, deserves to be treated as less than human, we become less than human ourselves. The tray slides under the door. Someone picks it up. And 3 times a day, every single day, we collectively decide what justice really means. Sleep on that. If this story disturbed you, good. That means you're still paying attention to what happens behind the walls we'd prefer to ignore. Subscribe to this channel right now. We bring you the true crime stories that mainstream media won't touch, the investigations into systems that don't want to be investigated, and the truths about prisons that authorities hope you'll never hear. Hit that notification bell because next week, we're taking you inside Australia's highest security women's facility, where the food situation is somehow even worse. 97% of you still aren't subscribed. Be part of the 3% who give a damn. I'll see you in the next investigation.